Okay, we're just a minute or two past our start time. I understand that there are still some people who are signing on, but I would like to go ahead and get started so that we have plenty of time both for our speaker and for questions from our participants. My name is Amy Kruppel, and I am the director of the UF Center for European Studies. The UF Center for European Studies is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and part of the Jean Monnet in the US network. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's discussion will be recorded and will be available on the UFCES website. We will have questions and answers session following the presentation, and participants can submit their questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Today's talk, Crisis Signaling, How Italy's Coronavirus Lockdown Affected Incumbent Support in Other European Countries, is part of a virtual series supported by the EU Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet program and the Jean Monnet Chair. We'd like to thank our co-sponsor for this talk, the University of Illinois European Union Center, and as well the Jean Monnet in the USA network. This discussion is part of our chair series, Pandemics in Europe, Political and Social Responses, which explores the political and social implications of the coronavirus in the EU, as well as looking historically at Europe's responses to and the long-term impacts of previous epidemics in comparative perspectives. For details on the other upcoming talks in the series, as well as access to previous talks in the series, please visit our website, ces.ufl.edu. We are very excited today to welcome our speaker, Dr. Catherine de Vries. Dr. de Vries is a professor of political science at Bocconi University. Her work examines the key challenges facing the European continent today, including Euroscepticism, political fragmentation, migration, and corruption. She is the author of dozens of articles and several books, including her most recent book, Political Entrepreneurs, The Rise of Challenger Parties in Europe, which is co-authored with Sarah Hobolt. She's currently working on research regarding the conditions under which economic hardship affects support for socially conservative political agendas and the role that the COVID crisis has played in this regard. And with that, I will hand the discussion over to Dr. de Vries, and I want to thank her again for joining us and all of you for participating as well. Catherine?
Great, thank you so much, Amy. Amy and I know each other a long time. It's great to see each other, even though remotely. Normally it's somewhere in the US or somewhere in the EU. Also, I want to thank Corinne for doing so much of the administrative help with this talk. And I want to thank everybody for taking time out. I know we're all busy in this pandemic, especially those of us who have caring responsibilities as well. So thanks so much for listening. So in that way, this is a little bit about incumbent support, maybe not so much about social conservative support or populism that I've been working on a little bit. It features a little bit in the talk, but it's also that for those of you who know me, I have recently moved to Bocconi, so the end of last year. And one of the things that happened when I came here was that in a couple, in the span of a couple of weeks, I was in lockdown. So in that way, I think as an academic, also these kind of personal experiences make us try to understand the world, and that's what I did in this with my co-authors, Bert Bakker, who's at Amsterdam, Sarah Hobolt, who's at the London School of Economics, and Kevin Arsenault, who's at Temple, in trying to do this paper. And I'll just give you a little bit of a personal anecdote. So I'm Dutch, living in Italy, and as I was going in lockdown, my friends in Amsterdam were just going around their ways, and we're kind of like, what's going on in Italy? And then they got more and more kind of stressed and upset when they saw the images coming from Italy. And this kind of idea of what happened in Italy might have affected the way people perceive the coronavirus in the early stage of, kind of what we call the first wave of the pandemic. This is what this paper is about. And particularly what we're interested in is trying to see if the lockdown affected incumbent support in other countries. And I will try to kind of illustrate why we're interested in that in the first place. Just for those of you in the US, we're really looking at the first stage of the pandemic, so not at the kind of politicization over partisan lines that we're seeing now, especially in the United States, also not of the second or even third waves that perhaps the EU was in, but really at that short period of time, which was maybe, let's say, from in Lombardy, the end of, that's the region that was very hard hit in Italy, the end of February until let's say May, right? That's the kind of period that we're looking at in this particular paper. So what you actually found in that time is what we in political science often refer to as a rally around the flag. So what we saw is that incumbents across the board, so even those incumbents that were playing down the virus, that were saying that the virus is not very important, that were not necessarily doing a lot of stuff, they actually also experienced a jump in approval ratings. So this is taken from Vox, the website, and that's based on Morning Consult polling in weekly averages between the 11th of March. Note that's 2 days after the Italy lockdown. The Italy lockdown was on the 9th of March and April 14th. So with the exception of Abe Shinzo in Japan, that probably also had to do with the Olympic Games and things like that, other elements that were going on in Japan. But across the board, we saw in many countries, so Canada, Australia, United Kingdom, the United States, but also Germany and France, we saw a boost in approval for incumbents. And interestingly, in the most of these countries, there was actually not yet anything that those incumbents had done in order to deal with the pandemic. And that's a topic that I'll come to in a minute. So we were very interested in the timing of these kind of effects of this initial jump. Not to say that these approval jumps stayed, right? So as I said, in the second and third waves, but really what we see is at an initial period we saw an increase. And here we look much more in depth at party data. So the CDU, so the Christian Democrats, that's the party of Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor. And what we saw basically is that gap between her party and the other parties. So this is what we call a Chancellor bump. So an executive bump that she got because she was the Chancellor, really started in the period between the 4th of March and the 11th of March, if you see it here. It goes from 24 to 26%. And actually, Germany had not really done much at that moment in time. So that was kind of like also, again, interesting for us. So what's really going on here, and why do we see that response? The same, of course, what we also saw with Donald Trump. Arguably, you know, in the period, he might have said now that he closed down flights to China, as Italy did at the beginning of the crisis in early January, only for those people to fly into their countries from a different route. So actually, many experts thought that, you know, closing down flights was actually probably a mistake in hindsight. But even if that was discussed by Donald Trump, arguably most experts would agree that since the kind of a time until the virus hit, especially New York City and New York State, that there was kind of a lost months, you know, like that Donald Trump didn't do particularly much, that even governors didn't do a lot. And that was the same perhaps in the early days in Italy as well. But nonetheless, even someone like Donald Trump, you know, not the most popular president across the board, across the United States, very, very kind of partisan support, saw a small bump in his approval. So we were kind of trying to understand, so what's going on here? What could explain this? And is this maybe similar to what we find in the time of, after war declarations, for example, right? Where it's not yet clear what's going to happen, but that people might be rallying around the flag, or is there more kind of an explanation about preparedness or about, more rational kind of explanations that could account for this finding? We're not 100% able in our paper to settle that, but I'm going to give you a little bit of information and insight on that. So what we're really trying to understand is, were citizens updating their perceptions of their own incumbent based on the evaluation of performance, or was there some other mechanism at work? And then basically, I already gave you some pointers as to why it seems unlikely that people are evaluating the performance, because there was not so much done by that particular incumbent. And actually, we saw this bump in countries where incumbents were not really, were kind of playing down the virus, right? It was not necessarily about them implementing anything. So, it's kind of an interesting effect that you see that across very many different contexts. And what we try to do in this paper is try to delve then deeper into how the first lockdown on European soil, so that was in Italy, infected incumbent support in other European countries. And what we'll try to convince you of is that basically the Italy lockdown was a signal to people in other member states that this was like a really a very grave thing, and this pandemic was a really serious thing. And that just, was come back to the kind of illustration on the anecdote I gave about my friends in Amsterdam, that they started to kind of think, oh, maybe this pandemic is really getting serious as Italy started to lock down, and it was clear that there was something going on in that country. So that's what we're particularly going to look at. So I don't have to remind you of I think of the situation in Italy. It was, really broadcast across the globe. So on the left, we see the trucks, the army trucks that were in the city of Bergamo. Bergamo is a city not very far from Milan. It is a small town. It is also a town that is populated with a lot of elderly people. About 3/4 of the population is elderly. And just to give you an illustration of how hard Bergamo was hit, so we see that about women lost about seven years of life expectancy in Bergamo, and men about 6 years. So basically what we see is an entire generation of elderly people died in Bergamo because of the virus. There's a lot of different stories about why that was. One thing was a big football game where there apparently were a lot of people that infected a lot of people, and Bergamo won, Atalanta won, and they took it into the town, into the cafes, etc. Football, of course, is a very important thing in Italy. There are different stories as to why Bergamo was hit so hard. And also what we saw a lot of images about overwhelmed hospitals. Here is a photo of an Italian nurse, and that, of course, we also saw images in the United States and in many other European countries about really the overwhelmness of that. So as the lockdown came out, and as these images very early on in that lockdown period also made headwaves across the world, we think that people are taking that as a signal as well. What's happening in this pandemic is serious. So what we try to do in this approach, because it's really difficult, so we can have this hunch, but it's very difficult to causally to really show that this is what's going on. And there we had the kind of particular advantage that that together with the Bertelsmann Foundation, with whom I cooperate on other things, we are running surveys, and those are surveys that are done every 3 months, so quarterly surveys. They don't have a lot of questions, but they have some questions, including some relating to your evaluations of parties, right? So we don't have an evaluation of the government, but we have an evaluation of certain parties. And some of the, and that's important. From that, we can generate a kind of government approval based on those parties, as well as a prime minister approval. And that survey was in the field between the 5th of March and the 25th of March. And then the Italy lockdown was on the 9th of March. And as some of the survey researchers know, most people answer surveys early on in the survey period, right? This was an online survey that was done. So we really have a lot of observations in, let's say, the first 1.5 weeks of the survey period. And then when someone assigns, and when someone gets the link for the survey is randomly assigned. So in that way, we have something where we have the lockdown falling into that survey period. Some people were interviewed before, they were asked about their government approval before the Italy lockdown, and some were asked about it afterwards. So that allows us to get a sense of, as it became clear that Italy locked down, what do we see in people's responses to those questions when it refers to government approval. So we compare those who were interviewed before and those who were interviewed after the Italian lockdown. And we do that in 4 European countries: France, Germany, Poland, and Spain. Those are the countries that have all the variables that we need in order to conduct this analysis. So for those of you who are kind of maybe have an idea, well, this sounds like a bit like an experiment. Well, it's kind of a more quasi-natural experiment. We don't, of course, have total random assignment, because it might be that there's some things, for example, you get a link, but you're younger and you're more used to clicking on links. So therefore you answer the survey the first day, and maybe some people who are older will do it the later days, right? So we find some effects that younger people are responding earlier, and that more highly educated people are responding earlier. It's not entirely surprising because it's an online survey, but there's some imbalance. But for the rest, we find really that there's no differences, that really it's kind of randomly assigned on the basis of gender, on the basis of urban residence, social class, unemployment, other things that we think are important drivers of government approval. So what we do in the paper, then we run the models with and without controls, and actually they don't do very much. So this imbalance on the basis of age and gender, so where we do find some differences that are not, that we cannot fully account for by chance, if you will, we do control for that in our analysis. If there are any questions about that, I'm more than and willing to talk about that. So in order to get a first kind of sense of like, did this Italy lockdown have this effect that we thought that? Was it this crisis signal? What we try to do is to basically look at people's Google searches, right? So Google Trends provides you information in different countries about what people are Googling at what moment in time. So here we see from the 22nd of January to the 14th of April, right? So that was that period in which, in the middle of that, we saw the Italy lockdown. And here what we did is we allowed for Google searches in the original language. So in French, Germany, Poland, in French, German, Polish, and Spanish when it comes to lockdown. So, but also in many countries, it's called in Italian, il lockdown. So many people are referring to the word lockdown. So we did both the English term as well as the translated native term. And here's what you see in Google searches. So this is basically the search volume of how many people were searching that. And especially the days after the lockdown, we saw huge increases in Google searches, right? So of course there were some lockdown searches before. For example, China had also locked down, South Korea had did a partial lockdown, but really the effect of the Italian lockdown is quite substantial in these different countries. You also see that, for example, in Poland, there's a spike a little bit after. In Germany, also a little bit after. So what we also do in the analysis is we also limit our analysis to those countries until they did their own national lockdowns, right? To make sure that that doesn't get conflated. So we do that, but that doesn't change our results. Just for if you're wondering. So another thing, what we were thinking about, so it could be that people are Googling these lockdowns, but what they're actually doing is it's not that they are maybe rallying around the flag or some emotional kind of response. Oh, this is a time of crisis, I should be supporting the incumbent. But it could be that they are getting some information about performance, even though the government hasn't done anything, right? Because we limit it, again, also until the government has done something. Well, then we thought maybe what they're doing is they're getting a sense of how prepared the country was. So one of the big things that were discussed, I think also in the United States, but very much in Europe, was the number of ICU beds. There's huge differences in ICU beds, and what we know is that people who get ultimately are infected by the virus and display symptoms and ultimately get COVID-19, that they are very likely to need oxygen and very likely to then end up in the ICU, and that's where the death rates come from, right? And that was also the problem in Italy, that those were very overwhelmed. But interestingly, the Italian lockdown doesn't seem that the idea that people have been using kind of Google Trends, using the same way to get a sense of preparedness of their country. Because here's, the Google searches for ICU beds, that doesn't seem to necessarily be a trend when it comes to preparedness. Also, interestingly, when it would be preparedness, when it would be this kind of rational preparedness argument, you would also see that incumbent approval should at a certain point nosedive when it becomes clear that Spain, France, right, and also Poland, when they get extreme amount of cases, as Italy does. And also that's not what we find in our data. We don't necessarily we actually find that incumbent approval stays up quite a bit before it, of course, at a certain point comes down, but that's much later. That's really kind of in the second wave that we see that. So it doesn't seem so much that it's this kind of rational anticipation or that people are really getting a sense of the preparedness of the government, but still kind of in line with this kind of rally around the flag idea that we were proposing. So in order for that to be the case, what we would need to see is that those people who have been interviewed after the Italy lockdown, so they would now get in our data, let's say a 1, that's an effect of them being interviewed after, vis-a-vis those that don't, right? So this shows the effects on government party support, on prime minister party support, but also on far right party support and on left-right ideology of being interviewed after or filling out the survey after the Italian lockdown. And what we see here, so remember that we had a little bit slight imbalance on age and education. So we do in the kind of light gray bar, it's where we have no controls, and in the black bar we have a full controlled model. And we see that those results don't change very substantially, right, between those two coefficients. So what we find in line with this kind of rally around the flag, we find a government party effect. So those people who are interviewed after the Italy lockdown display more support for a government party, but especially for a prime minister party, right? And that would also be in line with what we expect on the basis of these rally around effects. Interestingly, we don't find that it goes to like far right party support, right? So that also actually underlines that probably it's something about a rallying around the incumbent, because basically actually far right parties are mostly in opposition at the time, the exception being Poland, right, which is some we have some different scaling if the party and government at that moment in time is far right or conservative right. But anyway, for the other countries where we have far right party support in opposition, we don't see that. And also, interestingly, we don't necessarily see that people become more left-wing or become more right-wing. So it's kind of a robustness check that we do here, because we would expect with a rally around the flag that only people are more likely to display support for the incumbent, not so much that their overall ideology would change on the basis of this lockdown. And that's what we find. So then what we also try to do is try to do some other tests. So we just take different dates ahead of the Italy lockdown, right? So then there was no other country that had done anything. And we just take the 5th of March, the 6th of March, the 7th of March, in order to see if we don't find any effects there. So we don't find anything on government party, we don't find anything on far right, but interestingly, we find already little effects on prime minister party support. And that could, of course, be that, as the time that Italy was locking down, it's in some ways, it's not a real cutoff. It was a bit fuzzy. It was clear already that Italy, some of the kind of stories were already coming out. And what you see is that that's going then first to the prime minister before it generalizes to kind of the government overall. And that gives us also a little bit of an indication that probably is kind of a rally around the incumbent, even when the incumbent hasn't necessarily done anything yet. So I think this is kind of what we do in the rest of the paper. We try to kind of think about a new kind of research agenda that we can outline on the basis of the result that we provided here. So of course we cannot really test the idea that things as anxiety have increased or fear have increased, which is generally associated with this rallying around the flag that we know from kind of the more war literature. We don't unfortunately have, we didn't design this survey, so we used it in order for us to have a quasi experiment. But we didn't have all the questions that we would have. Note, we did look at some things like if people were concerned about their personal future, if they were anxious about their economic position, which doesn't fit 100%, but that does go in line, but that was heightened as well. So we do have an idea that, or what we would like to propose is that, it would be interesting to think about crises, not just wars, as ways in which, incumbents might in that initial period get a rally around the flag effect, which is generated through people's anxiety about, what is going to happen to me. The government better deal with this and better do something in order to help me out, right? And then overall, as the crisis unfolds, we might see different dynamics going on. So this is basically possible channels. Something is done or increasing anxiety, but we can't, say so much on the basis of that in this paper. So I think what's important to take away from this paper, and I've been quite explicit about saying that this is really about the beginning of the pandemic. Of course, as incumbents, as it becomes clear what they're doing in the COVID-19 crisis, and with the pandemic, are they going to kind of like, sail through it and have an incumbency effect or have a rally on the flag? No, right? This is really at the beginning of the crisis when they don't have so much information. And what we basically compare this to is some work in developing countries where we know that if a crisis hits, for example, a commodity shock, that people use any form of information that they get because these are low information environments, and in certain environments, to make up their minds about the incumbents. And you can think about it in a similar way. This is the start of a pandemic. We don't know what's going to happen. We see something happening in Italy, and we're already adjusting our, approval for the government because we want to, make sure that this person does something or gets something done. But of course, as the crisis periods unfold, so this is just some data from the United Kingdom, right, where, Boris Johnson has been, I don't know how much you guys have followed it, but there's been a lot of glitches. This week, there's been another glitch that there was an Excel file, which was supposed to give the number of cases, and that had to be contact traced. And that Excel file didn't work properly. And there were over 15,000 cases that were missed. So there were a lot of blunders that came out in the kind of summer period about Boris Johnson, including other things. And of course, what we do see is that even though he got as you see here, an initial jump, right, at the beginning of the time series, as his own performance on the pandemic comes out, of course, we do see a drop. So it doesn't mean that we're trying to say here that, incumbents just have a free ride. Of course, people are going to update, but at the beginning of that period, so that what we're kind of explaining is the beginning of this time series where you see here, right, you see it in March, like kind of going up very, very strongly. So that's, I think, what our paper can contribute to, and we really say, well, that Italy effect or that Italian lockdown effect could explain this initial kind of jump in incumbent approval. So this is what I wanted to share with you, and any comments and suggestions you might have, also implications of this or other work that I've done in this, I'm more than happy to share it with you.
Okay, I'm getting questions from all sides, so I'm rapidly taking notes. Some of them are coming through the question thing and others are coming from elsewhere. So thank you so much for the talk. I think the number of questions suggests that there's a high level of interest. Ron asks, can you address the possible link to the rise of populism? Some authors say the pandemic has broken the fever of populism, i.e. shown their rhetoric or promises to be false, that people need government after all. Your results seem to preliminarily support this idea. Any thoughts on that?
Should I just jump in straight away?
Sure, and then the questions are very diverse. I don't see a lot of cohesion yet, so why don't you go ahead and answer that, and then I'll line up the rest.
Perfect. Well, Ron, I think that's a great, I mean, it's also a bit the million-dollar question, especially for those studying European politics, where we've seen this, huge rise of populism. So it's also interesting that Sarah Hobart and I wrote a piece in the Washington Post on this question. So does the pandemic basically kill off populist parties, also based on the other work that we've done on political entrepreneurs? And I think the kind of argument that you're outlining seems right to me. And we find that also in other shocks, that economic shocks, for example, that hit a system, that when there is a particular kind of shock in that immediate period, people actually want government. And I think, for example, many Italians were quite happy that someone like Salvini was not in government. And actually the Five Star Movement, which arguably is a populist party, started to govern quite a lot. However, I do want to separate the health crisis from the economic crisis. I think we have to be very careful to say that populism, quote unquote, is dead. I really think that if you have an economic crisis, when migration numbers would go up, right? The lockdown also closed borders, so closed, migration patterns. If those developments go on, I think that populists definitely have an opportunity to come back, especially when people would get a little bit tired of government. But in the immediate health crisis, I think the pandemic is something different than an economic crisis, which comes from the economy, if you will, or that comes from bank regulation or something like that. And this is really something going from outside. And I think you're right, the intuition, I would have the same intuition that people actually want managerial politics at that moment in time. They want to be governed well. And then actually governments that didn't do so well have lost a lot of support. Someone like Donald Trump, but also someone like Boris Johnson. An interesting exception to this is someone like Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro went down very quickly and now has increased a little bit again. And what he, for example, did is he gave a lot of handouts to people. So just money, right? Vouchers to deal with the crisis. So I do think that we have to kind of separate the economic aspects from the immediate health crisis. But I would share your intuition.
Thank you. I'm going to merge two questions. The first question is it possible that some leaders' initial increased popularity was specifically because they had not yet taken any actions or only limited actions, such as putting a hold on flights from specific areas? And I would merge with that question, if you can, do you believe, and it may not be possible with your data, but do you believe that there could be an effect on that initial bump based on the perceived capacity or efficacy of the leader, right? Mm-hmm. So that sometimes a leader is believed to be extremely efficacious, like Merkel, other times maybe less so. And would that have an impact on that initial rally around the flag?
So I think these are great questions. So maybe I can address the latter one first. So in that way, I think it was very important for us to do this in different countries. So for example, someone like Merkel already had quite a reputation, indeed, for being a good manager, right? And for dealing with these things quite well. So that you would maybe expect in Germany. But for example, someone like Pedro Sanchez, who has just been a prime minister in Spain for just a period of time, and it was quite controversial. So he was seen as kind of an apparatchik, that is very much a party person, but not really so good at government. Podemos, another, I would even dare to say maybe former populist party, because they're now really in the active government, was also kind of in government. Giuseppe Conte, who was always perceived as a weak leader, who is now really changed. So I think that you're right, that it might be this initial bump. So we find a bigger bump of someone like Merkel, but we find it across the board, even in these other cases. And as I showed you some of the data before, even Boris Johnson, even Donald Trump, even some leaders who were perceived as not being so interested in government, right? So and being more interested in campaigning. So we still saw it kind of there. And it might lasted shorter in these periods, right? But that's the case. That's the case. But for example, Giuseppe Conte probably is now the most ever measured popular Italian politician, right? He's going at, he was not anymore, but he was at 75% approval of Italians who, you know, distrust their government very strongly. So it was an interesting story, and he was not necessarily perceived as a good kind of governor as well. So you can also kind of show your credit in a time of a crisis. Then with regard to the issue about, I think it was show off to be the good leader, and what was the, sorry, Amy, just that you remember, that I remember correctly.
The first part of it was asking whether or not the popularity might have been because they had not yet done some of the very unpopular things like locking down. Exactly.
So that is, of course, a question that we cannot fully address, right? Because we cannot observe that in that period. But interestingly, if we look at our own data, you know, like there are the national lockdowns also within the countries, we actually see that the national lockdown actually increased also again that incumbent support, right? So that Macron even becomes more popular when she starts to lock down. So I'm not sure. So of course you might be right that I think Italy made the lockdown seem like something that a European country would do too, right? If it was kind of perceived as kind of autocratic Chinese, I mean, a lot of kind of racism also about Asian people, even in how it was discussed in Italy and the Netherlands, the country I know best, about like obedient Asians, and that's why they would have lockdowns. But then, you know, like when Italy did that it probably would have been perceived by other countries as more of a European thing to do. So definitely you're right that I'm not sure that if, let's say, Germany would have put the lockdown in and Italy hadn't done it, that we would have necessarily seen the same thing. So I can't really talk to that, but I can talk to the fact that actually the lockdown in Germany or in Spain actually increased the incumbent approval. And I do think that it's very important for another study that I'm doing with Bertelsmann. So I think what's really important in Europe, that we don't see the same level of politicization of these measures, right? So we found, for example, so there are some protests, but they're very, very, very small. And for example, Salvini, that the leader of Lega, the extreme right populist party in Italy, tried to mobilize masks, and it just never got anywhere. And I think that we found also some other data that that supporters of populist parties are very likely to social distance, are very likely to wear masks, are very likely to also know correct things about the virus. For example, that it's not like malaria, that it comes from mosquitoes. You know, we've asked for Bertelsmann some of these questions. And it is very different than what we see of the data that comes out of people work like by Sarah Goodman and Tom Popinski about the United States, where Republicans are really, you know, has become quite partisan to adhere to these things. So that would be one explanation for why I think that these lockdown measures actually did not kind of crumble support so much, because it's just not politicized in the same way.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a question from Amy Verdun. My question is about lockdown. She writes, the part where you presented the implication from the Italian lockdown and the searches on Google, can you discuss that a bit more? And in particular, the lockdown searches could be interpreted in many ways. One, curiosity, importance is perhaps something else, right? So people could have been looking at it out of curiosity versus how important it might be. And the bottom line is, can you spell out what you wanted to accomplish through your use of the search on lockdown and the conclusions that you draw from it?
Yeah. So to be fair, in the paper, we don't go a whole lot and draw so much conclusions for the reason that you outline, Amy. Hi, by the way. So you're definitely right. It could be that just people are doing that out of interest. But I think if it will be of interest, maybe, you know, you should see similar. That's why we use also the period a little bit before where we saw lockdowns in other countries. You could still say, well, China is not as interesting maybe for Europeans as Italy. But therefore also we went to look at other things, like, for example, ICU beds, ventilators, you know, a whole lot of things. So I think that even if it's out of curiosity, what people are doing is they're getting information about what's happening. And with that, they're getting information about the virus, right? So if it would just be something like, unfortunately, we can't really hone down on this anxiety, what I talked about. But I think there is something to say that, for example, even when you're interested, if it will be something like, oh, I'm interested, but I disapprove of that, we should not necessarily see these type of effects. So I'm not 100% able to kind of say this is what it's doing. But I think what we wanted to do is just give you a little bit of a sense that if the lockdown is a signal about how severe the crisis is, and that will be a kind of driver as to why we see this incumbent approval, then we should at least see that people are Googling it, that they're not Googling it as in terms of preparedness, about their own system, but they're really kind of Googling at it as like, wow, this is about kind of the crisis. But you're right. I mean, we can't totally isolate that. At least what we can say is that what we find so far is more consistent with that, right? With the sense that they go online, they figure out what's going on with the crisis. Maybe for some that increases anxiety, maybe for some that increases the need that something needs to be done in their own country, and then they're upward adjusting the incumbent approval. I think from a more rational perspective, or let's say maybe not rational, it's not. I think this is a kind of rational thing to do when you don't know what the pandemic will look like. But let's say from a more retrospective voting model, where you would think that it's all about incumbent preparedness and about performance, and I think it would be more in line with a retrospective voting model when you would leave your evaluations unchanged until your incumbent does something, right? Or until it becomes clear that the incumbent is or is not prepared, right? So in that way, that's the kind of way that we interpret it. But you're definitely right that we can't, I can't pinpoint down, we can't with Google searches really know who these people are and what they should, and that's good as well, because it's of course would bring up a whole host of privacy concerns. But I think this is the way we see that result.
Okay. JJ says, fascinating talk. How does this rallying around the incumbent effect vary across context, region, etc., or demographic groups, age, more or less educated, more or less connected to other countries, etc.? Do we see this more or less in high versus low information environments?
Yeah. So hi, JJ. Good to see you. We would have met at EUSA, well, all of us would have met at EUSA if the European Science Association meeting, if it would have been. Anyway, by the way, organizing it in 2022, me and Stephanie Hoffman. So please, in Miami, Amy, very close. Exactly. Hopefully by then, everything is okay. Anyway, sorry, that little advertisement for EUSA. But anyway, I think, JJ, that's a great question. So we're a bit limited in, as you can understand, in terms of power, right? Because what we have is some people who are interviewed before, some people who are interviewed after, and overall we have 1,000 people in these, or roughly 1,000 people in these surveys. And then of course also some people haven't answered questions, right? So in that way we can't include everything, and we decided not to impute in this case, or not to estimate any of their possible responses. So we can't do all of the things that you highlight. So what we do is we try to understand if this is mediated by education, because I think that would be the sense, is that if it would be a kind of preparedness argument, or more in the retrospective voting model world, if you will, we would think that those people who are very highly educated, who are very interested in politics, they should be responding much more, right? They should know about the preparedness. They should, then reward or not reward their incumbents. But actually we find no effects, no differences across the board on level of education. And that makes us also think about that maybe this is a rational thing to do regardless of your level of education, when the information is kind of scarce. And that's the first period, right? We're really looking at until the 25th of March, right? This is really close. So it's 2 weeks after that Italy lockdown. So it's really the early stages of the pandemic. So I would hypothesize, we unfortunately don't have that different level of data, but I would hypothesize that if incumbent, that an Italian lockdown or foreign lockdown doesn't carry the same weight when it's done later, right? When it was not the first on a European soil, but what it would have done later. And if information environments would have been already more saturated, i.e. there would have been much more information about the pandemic. So in that way, I think that is mediated, but I can't give you so much on that in terms of that. But across these countries, we find it in these different countries, and some you know, we did try to look at like, was it only Spain, which is a country that has a language which is closer to Italy, where also many people, it's much more interaction between Italy and Spain, but we also find it in the other countries, right? So, for example, a country like Poland, which has much less interaction with Italy, or the population has, right? So in that way, I think it was really kind of a shock to the system, and that's also what I hear from many Europeans when I give this talk, like, you know, this was really a shock to the system what happened in Italy, and people started updating it, but I think, you know, you would find less of these lockdown effects now because, you know, it's all endogenous to the kind of to the pandemic and how governments are dealing with it.
Thank you. Speaking for me, it was absolutely a shock. So yes. Yeah. All right, another question. Is there an institutional effect? Does the character of the state, centralized or decentralized, federal or unitary, etc., or whether there is a coalition government versus a single party government, are those variables, those institutional variables, having any effect? I realize you only have 4 cases, so it might be difficult to test, but do you have any insights into that?
So that's interesting. So we, for example, so it is probably a conservative measure what we have, because we have support for the party, right? So we don't, for example, have Emmanuel Macron or Angela Merkel. So we're not asking for that. I would expect, that would be my hunch, that if you ask for the government leader, we do find it for the Prime Minister party. But we find that, for example, in France, it's very much driven by République En Marche, right? So by the party of Emmanuel Macron. But I think if you would have asked, that's not in the survey. We don't write the survey, but if it would have been like the government leader, I think you would have seen even more, right? Because that leader was in the news, was doing all the press conferences, you know, and that would be so much associated, and that was how we explain also that it really went to the Prime Minister party. For example, what we would think about in a kind of comparative government, that comparative politics literature, is that it should, you know, favor a dominant one party more than, let's say, government parties. But of course, the problem in Europe is that you're talking about all government coalitions, right? So these are all coalition governments. So there's no way of really knowing that. What we do know is that, in line with like Dave Fortunato and other work that's been done more generally about who people hold accountable, that it's going to the Prime Minister party, right? That's what we know from kind of coalition work as well. And that's what we do find. So if we would have had other countries, considering that we find that effect already, I would suspect that we would find differences based on how clear the signal is of who's in government, right? So that it would be a question about a leader specifically, or it would be a party that's a single party in government. But yeah, it's just speculation because we don't have that information here, and we not with the cases.
Okay, and then and you may also find that the limitation of the cases affects this question. How did incumbent support change for countries that did not have the immediate reaction or cases? Germany, France, UK did, i.e. Sweden or some of the countries in Eastern Europe. Again, you look at this very limited period of time. So I think for this question, it's probably one of what are your insights rather than what does the research itself show you.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, and that was also very clear that we want to say, and I'm also known to be like a proponent of retrospective voting and so on. I've done a lot of work on that. So I think that it's really what I'm trying to say here, and I've done in other work as well, when you have a low information, and I was referring to it, a low information environment where the implications of policy are not clear, where it's not clear what's happening, then you see these kind of effects. As the crisis and the pandemic falls out, of course, you're going to see much more that people are responding to what their government is really doing. However, what I find so interesting about it, and Amy and I were talking a little bit at it before, that what a government does, I think, is very difficult. So what I'm a bit afraid of is how it's being discussed. Oh, you know, in the New York Times or in the Financial Times, oh, this country was really good, that country was really good. So what works in Sweden, where you have very low, densely populated countries where people actually live primarily in single households, but there are not a lot of intergenerational homes, might not work for a country like Italy, where you have a lot of intergenerational contact, where grandparents take their kids to school, where you have intergenerational households, where you have the highest population, the eldest population in the world, right? Next to kind of countries like Japan. What is required in certain countries is very different. So I do think that also populations have a sense of that, right? that I think if you would have given Italian like the idea, oh, we should have done with Sweden, well, that probably would not been a good idea in this demographic structure in a very densely populated city like Milan or Napoli, right? One of the most densely populated cities in Europe. So I do think that it also varies across, countries and how countries are perceiving that. But I do think that there is something about what we find here is that many people have the idea in Europe that their country did it pretty well. Like that they're, so that's a little bit this kind of bias. However, when then there was a second wave or so on that's going on, I think the most interesting for me, observation, maybe also for Amy, because we share an interest in Italian politics, but it's like basically what's happening in Italy, right? So I've looked at some recent other data that we did in Opinions. So trust in democracy has gone up in Italy. Trust in the own system has gone up, because for Italians, it's like, wow, we're doing it better than other people now, right? So that's not something that Italians are used to, right? So there's these articles in the Financial Times, what did Italy do well, or on Dutch television. Whereas, for example, the country that I'm from, the Netherlands, is really now seeing the kind of highest second wave, right? So in that way, I think it's quite interesting how this is being preserved, and it's maybe also shaking up some of these traditional ideas. And that was the same way how Sweden was discussed earlier on, right? So, but I think in terms of how we as academic look at what would be the best, not that I'm a public policy scholar, but what would be the best way to deal with this pandemic, I think that should be very, very like the work that's done here in our COVID lab in Bocconi that really affects, mobility patterns, that affects, intergenerational contact. I don't know if there's a one size fits all. And then what you do see is, of course, that countries that had a lot of spread and that have a lot of mobility, that have a lot of intergenerational contact, that a couple of things work well, length of lockdown and, for example, mask use, right? But, the thing is, that's it's difficult to say that that's a recipe for everything, right? But I find it, maybe Amy is also in the call, like Amy might see it too, like as seeing the Dutch discussion vis-a-vis the Italian discussion is a very different discussion about, what should be done, and compliance was super high with health measures in Italy, much lower in the Netherlands. And that seems to kind of upset traditional ideas about what's Dutch and what's Italian. So that's also kind of be interesting in the future about how we as academics think about that and how people will view their governments in the future.
Yeah, we had a long-standing joke that the reason that the Italians were so supportive of the EU for so long is that they were just happy for somebody to govern Italy.
Exactly.
Even if it wasn't the Italians themselves. And yes, especially after the debacle of the Euro crisis, the refugee crisis, I think for Italy to feel that even though they were initially the hardest hit, they are not the hardest hit now. They are less hard hit than the UK, for example, has bolstered the sense that Italians can, and the Italian government can face front to a crisis and do well and be efficient. And certainly I think that will have long-term political implications for the parties in Italy as well. So this next question is obviously from me, and I just can't help it. What about support for the EU? How has this crisis and both the initial rallying and maybe not based in your research, but from a perspective of someone who's been following it, just the general difference in response? For me, I'm thinking a lot about Europe's response to crises and their inability to respond effectively, at least immediately, to the Euro crisis, to the refugee crisis, and comparing that to what is perceived, at least in the media often, to be a better response to the COVID crisis. And my take on it is that there has been more unity of approach because everyone feels threatened, as opposed to the other crises I mentioned in which it felt that there was a very disparate threat level and therefore a disparate willingness to see the EU jump in with both feet. But I would love your opinion on that.
Yeah, so I think it's really the kind of $1 million question. It's also something that I'm, of course, interested in. To be fair, of course, Amy, I did check if there was an effect, and we have a footnote in the paper. We don't find anything yet, but I think that was also because it was so early on, right? I mean, and I think that's not the case. So, of course, I think many of you in this call, it will be the thing, but maybe for those of you who don't know, I mean, the EU has no, except for maybe coordinating something, has no formal, what we call policy competences, i.e. Policy authority in the area of health, right? So that's really a national thing. It could have done things like sharing masks, and it tried that, but we saw a lot of nationalism and a lot of hoarding of masks for particular countries and so on, border closures, a lot of things that really affected the EU very much. So it was also initially in the country that I live in Italy, there was really this idea we're left alone again, right? So it was after the refugee crisis, and now that initial thing. Interestingly, Amy, I was looking at kind of the EU opinion strengths data, that actually now in September, where we polled, we do see that that in Italy, the EU attitudes have improved again, which what I would expect, because the recovery fund, so that was the joint economic response. So we didn't see a health joint response because there's no policy authority of the EU, but of course we did see a monetary and fiscal response, and that was because the EU has a lot of policy competencies because of the euro in that area. And I think especially the narrative of that this was indeed not a asymmetric crisis where, you know, some countries were hit because of something that they had done themselves, but this was something that every country could have had happen to them, and it just happened to be earlier on in Italy than in other countries. Really, really helped that in some ways. Also, for example, I would presume that the Dutch government is going to start using a lot of the health funding because it's enduring now so many extra costs from the EU, and that's also already clear what I hear from kind of like ministries that that's going to be used. So hopefully politicians will also acknowledge that in the debates, that actually the EU is then helping the Netherlands financially in some of these areas. So the interesting thing is that, of course, you saw something that was different, but you also saw something that was the same. So what you saw was that you had Germany was the big kind of shift, right? Germany went on the side of at least sharing debt, not legacy debt, not debt that was there before, but incurring debt together to deal with the Corona crisis. However, you saw the kind of what we call frugals, so smaller Northern European countries, including Austria, that were less proponent of that, especially the Dutch. And I think that was kind of interesting because Brexit also played a role in that, because the UK was no longer there. So actually the EU could move forward, the French-German motor could move on forward. And then, you know, these smaller countries were like, oh, but that's not what we want. And they had to then be clear about that. But I think it's also clear that at least in the immediate term, that actually the UK is not doing that well. So I think that has also helped Europeans to think, oh, look at the US, look at the UK. That would be my hunch, right? That we're not necessarily doing that badly, right? And that also a form of more social capitalism where you have, you know, insurance, employment insurance, and so on. However, I would also really distinguish again, Amy, I think the health crisis and what's happening now with the economic crisis. So for those who, you know, I was in a meeting in Germany and they said, oh, you know, the crisis is kind of over and so on, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, well, the crisis economically is just starting in Spain. It's just starting in Greece. It's just starting in Italy, especially when tourism doesn't get back up again. And then we're seeing these asymmetric effects again, not just in bonds, not just in the way investors are responding to government debt, but also in the degree to which, you know, there could be really a crisis. And the head of the central bank from the Netherlands, Klaas Knot, for example, gave also a speech, one of the most pro-EU speeches that a Dutch expert has given in a long time, about the fact that the risk of a Eurozone crisis is not gone, and that, you know, there's really a time now to maybe think about more kind of joint fiscal policy. So I see, yes. So I agree with you, Amy, that, you know, from that perspective, especially from an American perspective, you see Europe much more united than it was in 2010 and in 2015, but there are still some of these differences, and it will really depend, I think, on who wins the Dutch election, who wins the German election, and who wins then 2022 the French election. And I think that would be a really thing to watch, because these differences and these you know, Merkel, Macron works well, but if you get a very different person winning the German election that's not so pro-EU, you know, you might see something different happening, right? So I think that definitely there is this push, which the EU also needs to deal with Brexit. But, you know, the question is, you know, for how long will this last?
Okay, we have one last question, follow up from Amy Verdun. Everyone feels affected or it's symmetric, but we also need to think about generational differences. In the first wave, people were seen as one population, but the cause of the second wave in part is a lack of compliance by young people. And there's another comment, Catherine, in the chat window for you. But they are also less likely to die of COVID and the lockdown. And it's difficult, and the lockdown is difficult on teenagers and students in different ways than it might be on us old folks. So our analysis of the second wave will probably be different and need to consider the socioeconomic status of people and different generational groups. So, you know, in the US, we always think about those folks who are still able to work because their work can be done remotely, who are made uncomfortable by the crisis, but are not put into crisis themselves, versus those who've lost their jobs or are furloughed and have no capacity to work. So for them, it's a personal crisis, regardless of whether they get COVID themselves.
Definitely. And I think that is also coming back to the question of that I don't believe that quote unquote populism is dead, you know, like that dissatisfaction can really be rallied again. And I think, I mean, a couple of things to say about that. I think Amy is very right. So Guido Alfani, who is a colleague of mine at Bocconi, who is an economic historian, studies pandemics. So especially the plague, of course, his work has become, you know, much more relevant again today. And one thing they economic historian shows is that at least historically, and how we can measure inequality either from the Spanish flu or even from the plague. So, you know, going way back in time historically, that there is a little bit that depending on how economic structures are organized, there might be initial part where maybe there's some balancing out, but then actually inequality increases a lot, right? So that's what we probably would expect in this case, especially now when we have these technological, as Amy was referring to, these technological, or Amy Coppell was referring to here. I have to specify which Amy.
Amy and I are used to that.
Exactly, Amy K. Exactly. So that you know, there's very many socioeconomic groups, and that's really important. And I would definitely also think about that when we think about the actual economic crisis, which is, you know, that I would just want to urge also a lot of scholars, but also a lot of policymakers to think about this as, you know, the economic crisis is going to hit, and we don't know how it will look like in terms of recovery. We don't know about the vaccine. We don't, you know, a lot of things we don't know, right? And also many parts of the world are not going to get a vaccine until way later, so we can still have other waves again in the future, right? So it's really interesting to think about that. But the point on generations is great, because it's actually another project that I'm doing with one of my students here, Paula Rettel, and a demographer in our department, Francesco Billeri. And what we've done there is try to understand if the COVID crisis could be an accelerator for intergenerational conflict politically. So that actually what you see is you see groups pitted against each other. And you know, we're not entirely done with that yet. And we do the Netherlands and Italy because it has very different structures. But we also looked a little bit about the generalized rhetoric. We did it in the initial period, not within the first wave, not the second wave. But what was also very interesting in the Netherlands, there were a lot of discussions about, letting older people die. And that was not something you could say in Italian politics, right? So actually what we saw is that in the Netherlands, there was already some intergenerational conflict. It actually didn't increase very much, because actually the rhetoric from the beginning was already quite generational. Whereas we see in Italy, where there's, of course, a lopsided distribution and many old people. So it's not at all beneficial for a political party to mobilize anti-pensions, because that's your constituency, right? And they're going to vote for that. Any party has a lot of like elderly people within them. We actually see that there you see some more intergenerational conflict now developing. And the question is, will that then also last, right? Will that be picked up politically and so on? So I think this is a really important question. So I think, you know, this has been something looming anyway, right? And I think that when looking at the data for presentations I've given for that, I mean, what happened to the millennial generation? I mean, not even talking about Generation Z, right? Which is going in and not maybe having a job and whatever. But like the millennial generation is that they were just kind of recovering from the previous crisis. And now they're the first ones to go. I mean, the lockdown, of course, really helped elderly people and so on. And we're blaming a lot of the young. And I do want to be a bit careful with that, because I have the feeling that they were disproportionately hit by the previous lockdown. And also that when governments, especially in certain countries, when, like, I'm just taking here the Dutch and the English example, where we see a lot of young people spreading the virus. I mean, if your government tells you that the virus is not really there anymore and you go out and party, I mean, why wouldn't you, right? So I also have a little bit of the issue. I find it also myself not wanting to kind of defend the young and partying, but I find it also a little bit difficult. It's just kind of this blame that has now become on younger people, where they've often, where many, you know, governments have opened universities. They have opened a lot of these things. So they have also increased and the possibilities, you know, they've opened discos, right? That was the thing in Spain. Italy had them only open for 1.5 weeks and closed them again, right? So if you do these type of things, then of course you're going to get effects, and then young people are going to react to that because they're disproportionately affected by that initial lockdown, not just maybe also psychologically, but also economically. So it's a really difficult story when you start thinking about generations, right? And I think especially the economic hit for that younger generation is going to be very high. And if we then think about, for example, inroads that already someone like Le Pen, so Marine Le Pen of Rassemblement National, so the far right party in France, had made in the last election, where more millennials supported her than supported Macron. I mean, the question is how that's going to last, right? So this idea that populism, and maybe we're coming full circle to the first question, that populism is dead, and that, you know, we're really creating a quite precarious younger generation. And I don't know how they're going to view that. I don't know who they're going to blame, who they're, you know, how that's going to play out. But it's at least going to be kind of, you know, interesting for political scientists, I guess, is the proper way to say it.
Well, I think we could schedule that for another talk in the future. We're officially out of time, and I know that lots of people have lots of places to go, not least you. So I know there's a few questions that we didn't get to. I want to thank everyone for sticking with the talk, and Catherine, I want to let everyone know that there is a survey at the end of this. When you click out, you will immediately be shunted over to a survey. We really appreciate your assistance by taking a few minutes to fill that out. And again, as a reminder, this talk will be available on the CES webpage. That's ces.ufl.edu. It takes about a week to 10 days to get it fully edited and up, but it will be there, and you will be sent a link if you were registered for this talk. So you'll have access to this talk after the fact. And you'll also be able to find their information on both past talks in the series and future talks. And we also support other talks from the JM in the USA, Jean Monnet in the USA network. So Catherine, thank you so much. It's been a really fantastic talk. I did have one question about whether or not your collar was symbolic.
So I was wearing it before in another talk, and someone asked me that, and I said, actually, it was not symbolic. And today, when I put it on, it's like, oh, it doesn't matter. It can be symbolic. So partly, exactly.
Okay, we'll take it as symbolic.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who has participated in the talk.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you also for great questions. And if anybody has comments that I couldn't address, you're also more than welcome to email me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.